Uh, I want to thank the conference sponsors for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts. I'm not representing anyone when I do this. These are just random thoughts. So I think one of the goals would be to find a way to better share what we know about technologies and advanced technology. We covered that, so we'll skip that slide. Somebody else has talked about the magnitude. We know the size of the problem. Why do we need some new approaches possibly now? Well, one, we have a greater level of public awareness. We have a new technology focus. We clearly could benefit from greater coordination. I think we keep hearing that time and time again, that a lot's going on, but we're not quite sure who's doing what where. So one way to approach this might be to establish some sort of technology center or center of excellence with components that did everything from sharing what we know to finding a form or a format for advancing new technologies. Obviously, I think, again, we know the need for the most part, but to summarize, coordination, communication, who's on first, who's doing what. We need a good protocol to vet technologies, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. I think the bottom line benefit would be both to the Clean Water Act and to CERCLA if we had some enhanced process. And then lastly, I'm a strong believer in a clearinghouse, and Dr. Bennett and I got to share his thoughts from the concept of clearinghouses in the past, and I think that's a good way, and there are some precedents out there for clearinghouses that would help us. So the first thing is to take away is enhanced communication. We have a lot of players, but who are they? Does anyone honestly know who all's playing in this arena? I did a little looking as a part of this, and I just gave up because there are so many players who are doing so many different things, unfortunately not super coordinated, and some of the efforts at coordination have actually diminished over time as agencies such as EPA have pulled back some of their budgets that they historically had. So if we had enhanced communication, we could minimize duplication, we could increase the knowledge of results, and it might help to overcome, as I mentioned, the reduction in federal budget funding. We had two programs, ETV and the SITE program, in the past. I think both did great things. And as we mentioned yesterday, I think maybe during Dan's presentation, the SITE program funding ended in 2006, but there were pipeline projects that carried over to 2009, and then the ETV program ended in 2014. And both of these had a role in characterizing and advancing technologies. So this just supports the idea of needing some communications forums such as a clearinghouse to share our ideas. Now again, these are kind of random thoughts, so record them and hopefully we'll have time, a good time for discussion. I'm a strong believer in the need for a rigorous protocol that needs to be checked off on in advance. People who enter the program know that if they follow this, they get something at the end. They get some sort of dispensation from some of the requirements, or the best result of all is to have enough EPA involvement and buy-in that your solution is accepted to a certain extent if you have gone through all this. The concept maybe of like a seal of approval or a good housekeeping seal with the appropriate conditions as to where this might fit. Also, that acceptable protocol has to really consider a lot of ancillary aspects. You know, what are my infrastructure requirements, needs, impacts, risk assessment for my waste, environmental impacts. Certainly, as you know, in this area, community impacts are very important. The whole concept of building a protocol which can address upfront as many of these potential outcomes as possible. I would also include that You need to consider, we mentioned the National Contingency Plan earlier. There's nine criteria there that would have to be considered and built into the protocol to the extent possible. There is Region 8. I don't know if Steve is here, but I think it was March of this year, they put out a little document on the use of the adaptive management approach, and the 9 criteria are listed in there, and how advancing innovative solutions, it tailor fits some of these ideas. So some of the technical aspects of the protocol, and I don't want to step on any toes, but I heard the term recently, pixie dust, so I had to incorporate it. Protocol has to be adequate to preclude pixie dust and black boxes. Those aren't very helpful solutions. So you'd have to have an adequate physical facility that could guarantee you have consistency and a good solid QA/QC. And here I think is one of the first trade-offs that we may be struggling with a bit. To some extent, I think the steering committee is dealing with that, and that's proximity to sites versus the existence of a physical facility. So those are the kind of issues and trade-offs you have to consider. You absolutely would want to include the opportunity for private parties to advance their technologies and solutions. And with a little academic background, I'm a strong believer in the need for an academic involvement at a high enough level to make sure that you have competency and consistency. The change strategy possibility should be addressed in a protocol as well. That's something we're talking about more and more, is maybe one solution doesn't do everything at all times for every site. Maybe there's incremental or a series of strategies where somewhat along the lines of the old pre-treatment program, where you could pre-treat and then you treat again to some extent. And then obviously you have to have a fairly rigorous managed review of the results. And I think in the best world, all this would then fit in to a clearinghouse concept where this solution would be, it has gone through the process, it's passed the test, it would work under these general situations, which then would have to get customized for each individual site. But at least it gets you a little farther down the road than just deciding that lime treatment is the default treatment of choice to the extent it is today. So clearinghouse. I think a clearinghouse really, to me, becomes an important task that might be a first success story of this whole concept of a technology center. I mean, after all, how can we know where we want to go if we don't know where we are? So I think the clearinghouse has some real benefit in that area. It would track and document it. It would look at the suitability criteria for each technology, and it would characterize aspects of the impact such as infrastructure, O&M, et cetera, which becomes very important. An ideal goal would be to find technologies which frankly have the least long-term O&M and continual needs for operation results. This is very important to a state because a state not only has to participate in the initial solution, after a point in time, it becomes their burden to bear the cost. So the idea of managing the O&M costs to the extent possible is really a noble goal. So where are we now? That's the very first important question, I think, in understanding our technology effort. And I have to digress and tell a story here. Being a West Virginian, the story obviously is seated in Ohio, and it involves an Ohio State graduate, I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, who was a gas station attendant. So the guy pulls in his car to the gas station. He says, "I need to know how to get to Pomeroy. Could you help me?" And the attendant responds by saying, "Well, where are you now?" So think about that. We can't go ahead until we know where we are now. So the very first aspect is, where are we now? Do we actually know what all is happening in all the federal agencies? And there are a lot of federal agencies who have research roles, technology roles, EPA, Interior, Forest Service. Historically, DOE had lots of money, as we heard, I think, yesterday, and also a lot of responsibility, and DOD did too. And certainly in advancing a number of these technologies, a part of this came in from, frankly, their role in CERCLA at federal facilities. So we can advance those technologies. The Superfund Task Force was mentioned yesterday, and I think specifically I wanted to highlight under Strategy 4, recommendation number 7. And not reading the whole thing, but it says as a header, promote the use of third-party optimization through the remediation process and focused optimization on complex sites, et cetera, et cetera. So that's clearly on point to the idea of expanding technology or technical efforts in tracking. States also play a role, and again, I just did a minimal look at some of this and contacted some of the states. And while there are activities going on, most of these activities are not, or at least in my really meager research, occurring in the state regulatory or environmental agencies. Most are occurring in the universities in the state. Now, the source of funds for that may be granted through a state agency or otherwise, but the actual boots on the ground work is being done there. NGOs, there are a number of those. I just picked on ITRC. It was mentioned earlier, so I'm not going to go into that again. That's a public-private partnership focus. It's a child, so to speak, of ECOS, which is the Association of State Environmental Managers. And we also, lastly, in current technologies, I think there's 2 private leaders I would point out. Newmont, which I know is, Devin is here, and Freeport-McMoRan. Both of those entities are very active in technologies, and one of the things that I looked at a little bit in doing this is both of those actually have activities ongoing with Trout Unlimited. So you have the private sector coming in and working with a particular targeted NGO, and it's a good example of technology sharing and technology advancement. But why don't we just take all this and leave it to the private sector to do? Why do we not, or why could we not just rely on private sector to do everything for us? Well, I think there's a few issues. Abandoned mine lands have ownership issues. They're not all owned by these private sector companies, and I don't think they're particularly keen to step up to take on more liability at these sites. So we have that. They have an emphasis on active sites, solving their own problems first. An advantage is, as a place to try some of these things, some of these active sites do have permits for discharging, so that would possibly facilitate attempting to implement a technology at an active site versus an unpermitted site that is not currently an NPL site. The other thing is, if I'm a private sector industry person in this area, I'm probably more focusing my research on product enhancement or the ability to get the last bit out of that ore rather than worrying as much about the legacy issues. And that's only fair because I've got a business and I've got to make a profit. Another point is their technology is valuable. What's the nexus between the value to themselves versus the value to the market? You know, it could be if I keep this to myself, it ultimately has more value than if I allow it to be marketed and more of my confidential processes, become open, so to speak. Lastly, I think infrastructure is a big issue in advancing technologies on abandoned sites. If you have an active site, the infrastructure issues should not be as great because you've got things you're ongoing, so on and so forth. So, what are some of the hurdles? Well, can an agency ever agree to a protocol and a result without a second bite of the apple? I think under CERCLA, we've heard a lot of at least circumstantial evidence here today that that's probably not possible, but if you can move that up as far as you can in lowering that ongoing liability, it's probably still worth doing. So even though that's a hurdle, you want to engage with agencies and have a commitment to an approach. You have to absolutely have a sufficient but manageable protocols. It would be nice to have an ability to utilize a technology you've advanced at multiple sites. But again, I think as a part of, say, a clearinghouse concept, you're going to have to take your technology and it's going to have its attributes and requirements listed in sufficient detail that I can say, okay, I've got a good chance of applying this to site X. And sort of have that detailed in this concept of a clearinghouse. So I could go through my clearinghouse. I still spin through paper. The modern person would Google it, probably, and find out what technologies are applicable. How do you define in terms of having a center of excellence, how do you define a workable structure with many diverse stakeholders? And I think we got a little flavor of that yesterday on the steering committee. Many of the members of the steering committee, while there's a common focus, there's a uniqueness of what is the highest priority for many folks. How do you overcome liability for in situ demonstrations? That's a real issue, isn't it? And maybe you will get some good Samaritan legislation because of splitting the components, as was discussed earlier. Excuse me. How do you manage confidentiality? In any kind of protocol that you develop, you've got to have a sufficient detail to evaluate. In other words, no black boxes. I've got to understand the process. And I've got to take that and compare it to what's my loss if I disclose my intellectual property. So what's my trade-off? Agencies commonly deal with this in the permitting process anyway, where information is submitted that's confidential and so on and so forth. But in the case of technology, more of the aspects of the technology and how it works would obviously have to be an open process. So there is that trade-off that has to be managed. And then finally, going back to the private party, you have the internal versus the commercial value of the technology developed. I've got this great technology, but am I better off to keep it for my own use rather than share it and place it on the open market, where I may get some initial benefit, but then I've lost the uniqueness of this. Not only do all the abandoned sites have it, but so do all my competitors. And I've just taken all my research and turned it into a public document. Lastly, I think a real important hurdle is understanding and managing the regulatory and practical requirements. In other words, don't go out and complete a prototype without some understanding of the regulatory overview. Because at the end of the day, when you're done, you might be in for a rude awakening that you didn't consider A, B, C, D, which are absolutely mandatory regulatory hurdles you have to get across. So what's the way forward? Well, we need leadership to develop whatever gets developed. Should this be EPA? Historically, that's been a source of dollars. I think you also have to probably end up with what I'll call focused subgroups to take various components of a center of excellence or whatever forward. A clearinghouse, a protocol, a physical facility, community aspects, all those things are important things that have to be considered. What possible structures could you have? You could have an independent entity. There is something called National Sanitation Foundation International, which is to food safety and some of those issues like a good housekeeping seal. They have training, they have protocols you go through that if you do a certain thing, you get their seal of approval, and it carries weight in that industry. So there's that precedent out there. You could have it within an existing NGO. You could actually theoretically have a profit pay for play, where technology proponents pay a sufficient fee to go through the vetting process that it sustains the entity that's, managing this. You're going to have a university consortium leading something like this. There's a precedent within DOE. Those of you who are familiar with DOE laboratories know that university consortia have run those for years and years. University of California being one of the bigger ones, say at Los Alamos. You could finally have a government lab. You could have an EPA doing all this. Now, there's concerns within all this, and I think the possible structure, to me at least, boils down to where's the money coming from, like the old household finance argument, for those who are old enough to remember that jingle on the radio. Where's the money coming from in all cases? And in the case of EPA, you have the concern of peaks and valleys. That's the way I would characterize it within a budget. You know, this is a high priority, it's moving forward, and then all of a sudden it isn't. And you couldn't do that for an effort like this, because this has to be sustained at a certain level to have enough leadership and consistency to go forward. Finally, should the initial focus be on Bonita Peak? There's a lot of energy and suggestions that it should be. That's, I think, a point still of discussion. So, what are the outcomes? I think we definitely need opportunity for demonstration of new technologies. We need an increased acceptance of new site-specific solutions. And there I would include passive, active, what I'll call in situ, chain, you know, all the above have to be incorporated into this. So we have enhanced opportunities also for a combination of approaches. You know, we heard earlier in I think it was the legal panel, the discussion of, I want to try this, but it may not be sufficient. There may be a comeback. I think that is not unreasonable to build into the process to begin with. The fact that this may have a comeback, and I do these in incremental steps. And I understand that it's a combination or a chain approach. That's a little bit like, I think the term is adaptive management. It's the same kind of concept, that we're going to experiment, you know, and failure isn't going to be the end of the world. We will move on and try something else. I think in some of the areas we see there should be an increased focus clearly on the advancement of passive solutions, because you have probable O&M benefits. You also have infrastructure site accessibility, all these kind of considerations which say, if this works, this is a real advantage for us. Finally, enhanced communication, clearinghouse, whatever. And lastly, there needs to be better integration with EPA ORD efforts.